I'm Rachel from Cap and Cork, and we're stepping up to the bar today with Ryan with
Luxco/MGP.
There you go. You get one of those acquisition slash everything.
Yeah, at Luxco we are the sales and marketing arm of MGP.
And Luxco, I will say, is one of our favorite brands around Cap and Cork. You can probably tell when you walk in any store and location. So then with the MGP acquisition, it just sort of sweetens the deal.
Yeah.
You get a lot of heritage and history that comes into the whole portfolio.
Yeah, with MGP producing so much of the whiskey out there today, especially the rye whiskey, and it being in my backyard in Indiana, it was great for me and for the company.
And when people talk about, and I know we're in the middle of Bourbon Heritage Month, but we have to remember you can't have bourbon without whiskey. And with that, you still have rye whiskeys play a very big role in that overall bourbon story. Even from the respect of what MGP plays in the realm for distillers, small craft distillers, the whole shebang. So just give us a little rundown, MGP wise, how they operate a little bit.
Okay, so MGP as a company, they have multiple things that they do, but probably what they're best known for with a lot of people is their bulk whiskey. So they have a bulk whiskey segment, and then they came out with some of their own brands. So we kind of are taking on those brands under the Luxco umbrella to help to get them out in bigger distribution and out there for everyone.
And even from the movement of Indiana Rye being a officially recognized spirit and that type of thing, I think it's just all part of the process. But with MGP, there's so much history. And I think that's something that we overlook. Sometimes people might look at sourcing differently when it comes to that, but there's so much rich heritage and information, knowledge that's poured into each of those barrels, regardless of if it's one or if it's 1,001.
Sure.
So where does the now MGP heritage, where does that stem back to?
So Lawrenceburg, actually, I don't know how many people know this, but it's also referred to as Whiskey City. And so Lawrenceburg was laid out in 1803, and the first distillery actually known to be there, documented, was built in 1809.
So that is, I mean, we're talking about the forerunners of when Indiana met statehood.
Yes.
We were making whiskey before that.
Yes.
Type of thing.
So Lawrenceburg and the site where MGP sits now has been the site of a couple of, multiple distilleries. And actually the site that it's on now would have, had two distilleries back in the day at the same time. Yes. So when we look at the lineage then, Rossville is kind of the start or the crux of it. Sure. So the Rossville distillery was built in 1847 by George Ross and a couple other guys.
Okay.
They ran that until George Ross's death. And then it's changed hands multiple times since then. And then it was taken over by a fellow by the name of Walsh in 1877. And then it was actually registered as Distillery number 7.
Okay. In Indiana or just
in the National Registry.
In the National Registry. Gotcha. So from there, where do we go when it comes to the next story?
Well, so you can kind of bounce around because you can get all the way up to when Seagram's purchased it in 1933. Okay. After there was a big fire in 1932 that burnt down the distillery that was currently there.
That was there.
So then they rebuilt 1933. Seagram's took it over, and that's where most people now know that distillery site to be the old Seagram's distillery.
Right. So if you're down there, you see Seagram's on the side of the building and stuff like that. And I'll include some photos in here of our when we did some of our MGP picks down there with Rossville and George Remus. So where does then George Remus come into the story?
So George Remus kind of fits in here, and the reason that they picked him for the name of their bourbon is George Remus started out as a pharmacist in Chicago.
Okay.
Then went on to be an attorney. Well, while he was a defense attorney, he was defending all these guys that were getting in trouble for bootlegging. So they would pay a fine, but they were making much more money than he was. So he thought...
He saw an opportunity.
Yeah, why shouldn't I make some of that money?
Right.
So in 1921, he bought the old Squibb distillery down there, which would be kind of in the southern part of the MGP campus today.
Okay.
And
so neighbors.
Neighbors. And the reason he did that is because during Prohibition, when it started, you see all the promotional pictures and the movies where they axe the barrels and dump it out. Well, they didn't actually dump out all the barrels. If you owned barrels in a barrel house, that was your personal property. You got to keep it. You just couldn't sell it to anyone.
Okay.
So
it gets dealt with differently. It's not just like all down the drain.
Sure. So Mr. Remus, being the entrepreneur that he was, decided he would buy those barrel warehouses. So he bought this distillery, and then he a lot of times would pull some out for medicinal purposes. You could do that. You could pull out certain barrels. Well, he also would pull them out. His guys would be, when they were on the trucks, to be taken to wherever they were going. Another group of his would rob those trucks. So then those barrels could be reported as stolen, and they were gone. And so therefore he could sell even more barrels.
Even better.
So, and Mr. Remus is thought to be the inspiration for Gatsby in The Great Gatsby.
Okay.
Because he threw a lot of parties.
His lavish lifestyle and parties.
He liked to kind of brag about it.
I could see that. See that. Cool.
So there you go.
So, delving in then to what would be the rye focus of it.
Sure.
We have rye whiskeys and we have high rye bourbons. So they're two different playing fields, essentially. But what are these considered?
Well, so yeah, Remus is a bourbon.
Gotcha.
So bourbon has to be 51% corn, and then you can use your other grains. Most bourbons they use rye and then malted barley. Okay. Some can use wheat, but what they do is they use 3 different mash bills in the George Remus.
Gotcha.
So they will use some that are a little higher in rye content than others.
And they'll find different balances amongst those.
Correct. Okay. And that's where, like the Rossville, being a rye whiskey, to be a rye whiskey, it has to be at least 51% rye.
Okay.
So instead of the corn, it's the rye.
So that's where it's
and then you can use corn
rye.
And malted barley. That's why it's a rye whiskey. Now, with the Rossville, there is one of the mash bills that's in there, because they use 3 different mash bills, would be 95% rye. So now with this being a single barrel, they could have picked the one mash bill that was 95%
That was 95% rye. Fair enough. So part of the whole movement, and I think the law just passed, let me look at my notes. The law just passed in July to recognize Indiana rye whiskey as an official sort of product category per se. So to bolster kind of the integrity of what Kentucky straight bourbon would be, we'll have our own foothold in history when it comes to that.
Which it should be.
Exactly. But even from that realm with rye whiskey, like, what are the different expressions that we see out there? Are most of them playing in that 51% field, or are they going higher and going crazy and doing, like, has there ever been 100% rye?
Yes, so there can be 100% rye.
Okay.
What they would do typically, so like this one could be 95% rye and then 5% malted rye.
Okay.
So they would just malt the rye, and that would still count because it's 100% rye whiskey. Down at Limestone Branch, they have some of their experimental barrels in the rack house, and they have 100% rye whiskey there as well.
Is that in the world's smallest rack house?
Yes.
It's like
the cutest little barrel house.
Barrel house in Kentucky.
Yeah. which is kind of where minor case rye comes from. You know, it is, if you read on the label there, it is Indiana whiskey. So, you know, back before Luxco was an arm of MGP, we were a rectifier, which what that meant was we didn't produce our own whiskey, we would buy it off of others, or others would produce it for us. So this juice would have come from MGP, say, and then finished in a sherry cask. But Minor Case Rye gets its name from Steve and Paul Beam's great-great-grandfather, Minor Case.
So one thing I always...
Great-grandfather, Minor Case, I guess.
Goes way, way back.
I don't know which, if it's double greats or great. I think it's great-grandfather.
It's really great.
Yeah, it's really great. It is a great rye whiskey.
It is. It's really great. I think there's an art in that selection process, and even catapulting smaller craft distillers forward in their barrel finishes and the other things that they can do.
Yes.
So you think of harnessing the power and the magnitude that MGP has and can do, and just amping up the timeline for a lot of distillers across the country to be able to select barrels that have age to them, that have different mash bills. So right here in our little corner of Indiana, we're actually pushing that envelope forward when it comes to bringing great whiskeys and bourbons to the world.
Yeah, we're sort of giving birth to all of these great little distilleries.
It is.
Because yeah, if you build a distillery, you know, it's going to take you a little bit of time to get up and running and aging and all of that.
And fine-tuning a mash bill and the whole shebang, where you could come into the MGP catalog and say, let's try barrels in this realm. And
it's with somebody that has been doing this for a long time. A lot of great master blenders there that know what they're doing. So they are the masters of whiskey.
It's not just a barrel that you're buying. It's the integrity and ingenuity of a company that's been doing it forever.
Yeah. You're buying that experience. You're paying for that experience and getting, you know, as I said, the masters of whiskey to do your whiskeys.
I would love to have them in my court if I was going down that road. I don't know about anybody else. So when we're looking at high rye bourbons, what percentage are we looking at of that mash bill that is dedicated to rye?
Yeah, so you know you have to have 51% corn. Well, then to make it a high rye, it's 20 to 35% rye whiskey, or rye in that mash bill.
In that mash bill. So that's taking up another pretty good portion of those different cereal grains they put in there.
Correct.
So even outside of bourbon, when you look at a rye whiskey, you have at least 51% rye.
Sure.
What kind of flavors or impacts is that going to have to the end product?
Well, so I look at it from my standpoint, rye adds that spiciness to it.
Okay.
So your corn is going to make it sweeter the more corn you have. And that's why, like, say, a wheated bourbon, sometimes it's thought of to be a little softer and sweeter. Is not necessarily because the wheat's making it sweet. It's just allowing the sweetness from the corn to come to the front. Whereas a rye, it's going to add that spiciness, and maybe
rye is going to remind you that it's there.
Yes, like it's one of the master blenders, David Whitmer at MGP, talks about with like bread. Okay. So like if you think about it with rye bread versus like cornbread,
it's going to be a whole different realm, even from the get-go of the nose to the palate to the finish is going to be completely different.
Yes.
You know distinctively when you have rye.
When you have that rye. Nice. And that's why a lot of bourbons, you know, if you want to get into rye whiskey or even bourbons with a small rye content, there are a lot out there that are 10% rye and stuff like that. So it allows that corn to be a little more forward. And then you can work your way up.
So those are your gateways,
ryes. Yes. Gateways to the rye.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a different spirit for every palate.
Sure.
You know, there's people that aren't fans of rye, and that's fine. But know that even some of those great bourbons out there have rye at play in the mash bill somewhere.
Absolutely.
And I think it's finding that right balance for your personal palate. And there's those of us that might like that 51 and higher.
Sure.
Because they want to know what's coming to play.
Yeah. I mean, if you were someone that likes a bourbon that is wheated and you know it's wheated, so and you feel like maybe you just like wheated bourbons, maybe try something that has a smaller rye content. Or even if you're wanting to get into rye whiskey, this one right here is the play, I think, because it's got it's a little lower in rye content, but it also, when you finish it with a sherry cask You get that sweetness on the back end.
So it brings in a different profile to kind of...
Correct, balance it out.
Balance everything together. Okay. So this one's minor case. That one's one if you're looking for a gateway rye.
That would be a gateway for me.
Good way to start. Well, what are we gonna try here today? Should we go with the Rossville?
We might as well try the Rossville.
Let's do it.
I mean, what a tough job.
It's really rough.
To have to sample on the job. You know, you can look at the viscosity of it, the legs, you know, as it comes down the glass, the side of the glass.
But the first noticeable difference will be on the nose. And right out of the gate, you get some good spice.
Oh,
you know that there's a lot at play in there.
Correct.
Right out of the gate.
I'll take my first little sip here to get the palate woken up.
And I think that could be a deciding factor for some people. If you're a bourbon drinker or a weeded bourbon drinker.
Yes.
Taking just one sip of rye and being like, nope, put up the stop sign.
Well, if you haven't had anything to drink until your first sip there, get it, wash it around a little bit. Then your next drink after that, you should get more of the taste profiles because you're waking up your taste buds.
And I think he's amazing, even with this being a rye, how balanced it is.
Correct.
So I think so many people think they hear spice when they think of a rye and they're like, oh, well, that's going to be off-putting. But even with that spice, you're talking about something that's gradually moving across your palate and just warming the whole palate and all the way down to the...
Yeah, that's the other thing. Are you getting, is it warming you and not burning?
Burning, yeah.
But that's why I say if you take that first little sip and then you try to drink the second one after that, if you just shoot one back like I've seen some people do,
you're gonna hate it forever.
All you're getting is the burn from the alcohol.
Yeah, yeah. I think you have to take the time to appreciate it just as you would anything else.
Correct.
You, like, for stepping up to the bar with us today to discuss a little more about ryes, MGP, the whole like bandwidth of what is whiskey and how it plays into bourbon. I think overall we want people to just stay curious when it comes to these things. Explore, like go to your local bars and try something. Maybe even get together with somebody, buy a bottle of Remus, a bottle of Rossville, try a little minor case, and share.
Yeah, try it out, share it with someone and have conversation. I know that I learn something new every day about the history of whiskey in Indiana or rye whiskey or bourbon. I'm definitely not an expert on all of this. I am honored to be behind the bar with you though, and I don't have to work with Matt or Brent. I mean, that would have been, I would have actually said no to this.
You'd be like, no, I have to decline.
Yes.
Yeah.
So at least I get a good co-host.
Well, you know, every once in a while, Captain Cork can come in there in the clinch and just make it happen.
That's right.
That's all this week from the Cap and Cork Studios. We'll keep you in good spirits, and you keep us in good company. We'll see you right back here next week.